In early March 1945, units of the 12th U.S. Army Group approached Cologne. The city, which suffered terrible destruction and lost many residents under the attacks of the Allied air forces, had to pass the final test, the assault. Preparing for brutal urban battles, the Americans pulled up large forces to Cologne, but the Wehrmacht was far from what it used to be and could not show its former power. The Americans reached the Rhine. In February 1945, the Allied armies managed to break the resistance of Nazi troops in Belgium, almost completely destroy the 19th German Army in the Colmar area, and begin crossing the Rhine River. According to the German general and military historian Kurt von Tippelskirch, in a situation where the Allies had an overwhelming superiority in manpower and equipment, it would be prudent for the Germans to withdraw beyond the Rhine and organize a defense there. Many senior German commanders, in particular SS Obergruppenführer Paul Hauser, also insisted on the withdrawal of troops beyond the Rhine. However, the German command decided to defend Cologne. American generals planned to launch two simultaneous strikes. Units of the 1st U.S. Army were to advance between Düsseldorf and Cologne, and units of the 3rd U.S. Army were to advance through the Eifel Highlands. The main goals of this offensive were to encircle German troops and capture the Ruhr industrial region, which was vital for Germany. On March 4, 1945, units of the 1st U.S. Army, under the command of General Courtney Hodges, crossed the Rhine River and began to rapidly approach the third largest city in Germany, Cologne, preparing for the assault. During the Second World War, Cologne was subjected to brutal bombing by the Allied air forces, which, having carried out more than 260 raids, almost completely destroyed the central part of the city. The importance of Cologne for the attackers was that on its territory, there was a bridge connecting both banks of the Rhine. American generals assumed that the Germans would create a powerful defense in the city, following the example of Aachen, put up fierce resistance, and the soldiers of the 1st U.S. Army would suppress numerous pockets of enemy resistance for a long time. Units of the U.S. 3rd Armored Division under Major General Morris Rose and units of the U.S. 104th Infantry Division under Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen were advancing towards Cologne. The Americans prepared for grueling urban battles by forming mixed assault groups consisting of tanks and infantry units, as well as bringing in large-caliber artillery, new M26 Pershing tanks and M36 self-propelled guns, capable of resisting heavy German tanks and assault guns. M26 tanks had thick frontal armor, powerful weapons, good sights, and were the answer to heavy German tanks and anti-tank self-propelled guns. American troops near Cologne numbered more than 35,000 soldiers and officers, more than 230 tanks and self-propelled guns, and several hundred guns. Aviation provided effective support to ground troops. In the Cologne area, the defense was held by units of the 9th Panzer Division of the Wehrmacht under the leadership of Colonel Helmut Zollenkopf, who took command on March 6, as well as units of the 363rd Volksgrenadier Division of Lieutenant General August Dettling, the remnants of the 3rd Panzergrenadier Division of Lieutenant General Walter Dinkert, and battalions Volkssturm. The total number of German troops did not exceed 15,000 people. At the same time, according to the Americans, the enemy was able to assemble only 2 full-fledged infantry battalions, not counting tank and artillery units. The Germans were armed with more than 50 artillery pieces, up to 80 tanks and assault guns. In particular, the 9th Panzer Division in February 1945 had 29 tanks and 16 assault guns, fighting among the ruins. On March 5, units of the 3rd Armored Division were the first to break through to the outskirts of Cologne, entering the city from the north, and 2 hours later, units of the 414th Infantry Regiment and the 750th Tank Battalion under the command of Lieutenant Colonel John White arrived. Already in the first hours of street fighting, the Americans realized that there were 88 mm artillery installations in the city, posing a serious danger to tanks, and decided to call for support from large-caliber artillery. The American infantrymen made their way with the help of fragmentation grenades, which they threw at the German artillerymen, approaching them closely. The most fierce battles in Cologne took place on March 6, although their intensity can hardly be compared with the assaults on Aachen and Metz. During the assault on Cologne, Battle Group B encountered fierce resistance from a deeply entrenched force of German infantry and armored vehicles. Although our P-47 dive bombers had already processed the city and inflicted serious damage on the enemy, the Germans continued to hold it. This is how their direct participant, Lieutenant of the 3rd U.S. Armored Division Belton Cooper, described these events. In street battles, infantrymen from the 414th and 415th U.S. Infantry Battalions performed well, the way for which was cleared by tanks of the 750th Battalion and M36 self-propelled guns of the 692nd Tank Destroyer Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Moore. The self-propelled guns did not find the Tigers and Panthers in the city, but they destroyed the PIV and several assault guns. Heavy fighting ensued near the airfield, where Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Kane's battle group of the 3rd Armored Division came under heavy fire from 16 German 88mm anti-aircraft guns and lost several Shermans. To continue the offensive, the remaining American tanks had to overcome the runways under anti-aircraft fire. Having assessed the situation, Lieutenant Colonel Kane requested air support, after which he ordered the release of smoke shells and a cover attack on the enemy. The tankers' actions were successful, and the German guns were destroyed, the last pockets of resistance. Despite the fact that American soldiers managed to make their way to the city center and suppress most of the enemy firing points, the Germans managed to blow up the bridge over the Rhine and withdraw the lion's share of their armored vehicles to the eastern bank of the river. On March 7, the Americans fought with the remaining defenders of Cologne, suppressing the last machine gun emplacements and exterminating snipers in the northeastern part of the city. Moving south along the Rhine, units of the 104th Infantry captured the Ford Motor Company assembly plant, which produced trucks for the Wehrmacht. Results of the battle. The Germans failed to turn Cologne into a fortress city and pin down the American units, since Hitler's army was already far from its previous state. Ironically, on March 7, 1945, the same day that elements of the U.S. 3rd Armored and 104th Infantry Divisions were finishing off the remnants of the German troops in Cologne, soldiers of the U.S. 9th Armored Division were able to capture the bridge at Remagen and cross the Rhine a significant number of people and equipment. The capture of Colmar was not a big deal for the Americans. They lost about 30 soldiers and officers killed, and over 70 more were wounded. Up to 15 units of American armored vehicles were out of action, most of which were subject to repair. German troops suffered more significant damage. Over 24 guns, 12 to 15 armored vehicles, 120 to 130 people killed and more than 150 wounded. Several hundred more German soldiers and officers surrendered. The Wehrmacht's 9th Panzer Division continued to fight the advancing American forces, and by the end of March 1945 its strength had been reduced to 600 soldiers and 15 tanks. As for Cologne, after the end of the fighting it began to gradually return to peaceful life. Already in mid-March, residents began to return to the city en masse, and by the end of 1945 its population increased to 500,000 people.